o'clock. We'll start promptly. We have a few people joining us. So welcome all to the Ojai Climate Emergency Mobilization Committee. We had a meeting, what was it, 1 month ago already? Wow. So we're having these community meetings monthly. And so just quick order of business. I'll maybe remind folks who join later to let's mute ourselves when we're not speaking, to not have any background noise that can kind of be distracting. So if anyone's making kind of background noise, I'll just gently remind you to mute. So don't take it personally. But if I have to remind someone to mute, that's why. And then just so we're all aware, there's a 6 o'clock general plan update meeting following this. So we will wrap up no later than 5:30, depending on how long we all want to go. We could go until then, and just want to allow for ample time if people are attending the 6 o'clock general plan update community visioning meeting, to have a little time in between. So we'll wrap up no later than 5:30, and that's at 6 o'clock. I've signed up for that. I'm not sure if there's still a time. I think on the city's website, there's a Zoom link. So I'd encourage people, if you haven't yet signed up, to sign up or even just try attending at 6 o'clock if you can make it, because it's a really important, I guess, first public meeting for community visioning. So I'd encourage people to attend that if you're available. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to say right off the bat. And then Jim was going to kind of frame the conversation for what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this time. Jim, you can have at it.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, welcome to our monthly meeting. There's a couple of changes that we've made in terms of how we would like to approach this. On one level, we've decided to open up our meeting so that the public has an opportunity to interact at any point in the conversation, and that we can have more of a conversation around whatever you have to say, rather than just simply, one-way speaking. Today, we're going to be working on a number of issues. Specifically, we're going to have a discussion, and we have a guest, Mark Whitman, who's going to share with us some of the things that's going on in his world of architecture and building around energy, climate, and buildings. We also are going to be doing an update on the greenhouse gas inventory project that we're working on. And we're going to invite people to have whatever questions you may have at any point. But if you have a question, we'd like you to have your camera on so I can see you, number one, and that you wave your hand, number two, and then I'll call on you at the earliest opportunity. We won't take any communication if we can't see you. So that's our request if you'd like to ask something or have participate in the conversation. And finally, the committee has two recommendations that we're making to council, and that we have fully aligned ourselves on, having to do with electrification of city buildings, and also recommendations regarding communication with the U.S. Post Office regarding the upgrading of their fleet. So that's the overall agenda that we have in mind. And as I say, we're going to begin with some remarks by Mark Whitman. Welcome, Mark. And I'll let Phil introduce you, and then we'll continue the meeting. And again, turn on your cameras if you want to say anything.
Okay, thank you, Jim. As some of you know, or most of you might know, I'm a mechanical engineer and have been for more than 40 years. And I would call it architectural mechanical engineering, in that we work on mechanical systems and buildings, the plumbing systems, and also heating, ventilating, air conditioning systems. And we work with a lot of architects and facility managers. As an example of what my company's doing in climate, related to climate, today we started working on 3 school projects in Santa Barbara in the Hope School District. where the proposal is to replace existing natural gas furnaces with pumps. So that's what we're doing. I know a lot of the architects. We are honored today to have one of the best known architects in the Ojai Valley and in Ventura County, and Mark Whitman. And Mark has told us he's prepared to give us some commentary on what the AIA, which is American Institute of Architects, and the USGBC, United States Green Building Council, are doing with respect to energy conservation and climate. So Mark, we're really happy to have you here paying attention to what our committee is doing. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Phil, for that introduction. I have a lot to say here today, so I have a prepared speech or not a talk, and so excuse me for having to read this. But although I don't consider myself an expert, I have always considered myself as a green builder and have practiced solar architecture on all of my projects. I've been involved with the AIA COAT committee, which is a committee on the environment, and the USGBC, and I'm learning from some really smart people there. And I've been asked to talk here for 10 minutes, so I have a lot to say, and so excuse me for reading this, but and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but we are all aware of the effects of climate change. We have experienced it here in Ojai in the Thomas Fire, and we watch the news and other disasters and hear the warnings from the 98% of the science community. Al Gore explained it very well in his 2 movies, and I acknowledge the extreme situation humanity is in with regards to climate change. The world is producing 51 billion tons of carbon emissions yearly. The science community is setting a date of 2050 that we need to reduce carbon to a net zero. Some scientists are saying that that's not soon enough to avert disastrous outcomes. So I've been involved with the AIA COAT committee since the 1990s. In the 90s, this committee produced a material resource guide where they analyzed cradle to grave environmental impacts of all common materials. Recently, this committee has shifted their energies and are focused on the carbon footprint and mostly carbon neutrality. Recently, the AIA established a 2030 commitment of reducing carbon emissions in the built environment by 66%. They are now promoting all electric buildings. The built environment accounts for 40% of all carbon emissions. 25 to 28 of that comes from building operations, and about 11 to 15% is in the construction construction of the buildings. This 11 to 15% of embodied carbon is produced in the harvesting, transporting, manufacturing, construction, and disposal building materials. Most of these emissions are attributed to the use of steel and concrete alone. I'm also serving on the regional board of the nonprofit USGBC, the US Green Building Council. They are the creators of the LEED point rating system, where they grade the greenness of structures with the goal of developing a sustainable future. The system assigns a certain amount of points that a project needs in order to receive a certificate. There are different categories of compliance from water savings, community health, transportation, energy, indoor air quality, social justice, and they have just added zero carbon as a supplement. There are different levels of achievements: bronze, silver, gold, platinum. However, the system is complicated and costly and requires experts to administrate it. And most of those who use the system do so as a badge of honor. Currently, the AIA and the USGBC is educating and advocating to those in the building industry and government entities the importance of zero carbon. For instance, there is a bill on the floor of the state legislature being sponsored by the AIA. It is AB 110, which will require that every architect obtains 5 hours of zero carbon training every 2 years. In 2006, the USGBC lobbied to pass AB 32, which with the goal of lowering carbon emissions to 1995 levels by the year 2020. This prompted Cal Green, which introduced mandatory and voluntary sustainable measures into the building code. We are now required by code to have solar power, electric car hookups, water retention, and many other green devices in our construction. AB 32 was successful and exceeded its 2020 goal, and now has a 2030 goal of reducing CO2 by another 66%. California has always been a world leader in green building. In 1978, the Title 24 Energy Code was established, mandating that all projects meet energy standards. These standards have gotten stricter and stricter, and over the years, making our newer homes way more efficient than buildings built before 1978. In January 1st, 2020, Buy Clean California Act, AB 262 was initiated. Let me see if I can see where I'm at here. This legislature requires environmental product declarations on certain materials being specified in state buildings. Because the state of California spends $10 billion a year in construction projects, this bill would be our market driver in developing innovations in green products. It is a groundbreaking, world's first legislature. It is so important because we need innovations in order to meet the 2050 goal of zero carbon. USGBC has teamed up with other organizations to develop software that will help a user analyze the embodied carbon in the construction of buildings. Whole building life cycle assessment programs are being developed. Concrete, steel, glass, and insulation are being targeted as the materials with the highest embodied carbon. Some of the innovations that are taking place now are a blue-green alliance in steel production has partnered steel manufacturing with environmental groups to convert or replace steel mills from the coke ore to highly efficient electrical furnaces. Also, concrete is one of the leading producers of CO2. Some have estimated concrete produces 10 to 50% of all our carbon in the world. Low carbon concrete has been developed by using different mixtures, which can reduce CO2. Synthetic mixtures produces zero carbon are being explored. Europe is now leading the way in these innovations. Low carbon concrete is currently not a mandatory measure in the Cal Green. However, the County of Marin has adopted its own low carbon concrete ordinance, which is being introduced now in the state building code. The development of carbon positive products, or carbon sinks or embedded carbon, which actually reduce the embodied carbon in structure, is underway. The use of agricultural residue materials such as wheat straw, rice hulls, bamboo leaf to create building blocks, cork, hemp, algae are being used in building materials. We are starting to build mass timber structures in low-rise and high-rise structures using manufactured wood beams, which are super strong, which replace the traditional steel and concrete construction used in high-rise buildings. I think we need to further develop alternative materials such as cob, rammed earth, and a product called hempcrete, which also substitutes steel and concrete. The reusing or the remodeling of buildings needs to be emphasized as one of the best ways of reducing embodied carbons. It is projected that the world will construct around 2.4 trillion square feet of new construction by the year 2060. This is equal to 50 Manhattans. So it seems impractical that we can eliminate all carbon from construction. So the purchase of carbon offsets will be a future cost of buildings that we must bear. This money will go into developing of carbon filters or air scrubbers to eliminate carbon from the air. These air scrubbers are also being used in factories to capture carbon before it is released into the atmosphere. So a lot is going on to achieve our 2030 goal of reducing carbon by 66%, but we need more aggressive measures to reach our goal of zero carbon by 2050. I would hope it would be a voluntary measure and not heap more regulations on already over-regulated system, but I don't see this coming. I see a zero carbon ordinance being introduced in the building code very soon. I also see pushback from the climate deniers being a huge block in the steps that are needed to avoid a worldwide catastrophe. Sadly, I believe it is not until we have this major catastrophe before drastic actions are taken worldwide. That is why resiliency is also important as an important determinant in our built environment. And perhaps it is our role to have tested systems in place so the world can act quickly when the time comes. But that is why I truly feel that your committee is so important. Your work is in the forefront of the battle. Even though it is a drop in the bucket in terms of lessening carbon, this committee's REACH code, recently passed, is being talked about in our community as being one of the most aggressive and far-reaching. But we need more, and your leadership is what is needed. And I applaud your efforts, and I would encourage you to do more and lead further. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to open this up to questions and answers for people in just a second, but I have a question. Bill Gates's new book talks about we produce 51 billion tons of carbon every day, or every year, sorry. And that by his numbers, the world needs to get that down to zero by 2060. You've talked about percentages in the building code, in the building trade, in the building world. But have you got any grasp of idea in terms of what that looks like as tons? If we did all the right things, roughly what scale of impact might we be having on that 51 billion tons?
Well, it's 40% is attributed to the built environment. So 40% of 50 billion is what, 30 billion? You can do
well,
that.
If we were even half effective in that world, we'd still have a big bite in it.
Yeah. Sure,
yeah, that would be great. Good. And anybody else on the call would like to say anything? Again, turn on your camera if you want to speak, so that I can call on you. Just wave your hand and so Sousa, councilman, council person, you have to take your mute off.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. There you are.
Okay, yeah, councilwoman, that's what I like.
Okay, councilwoman.
So I think what Mark said is so important. I'm going to inquire if he could do a presentation like this at the city council, and then it would be videotaped and all of Ojai could hear it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Oh, be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ray, you have to, yeah, good.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I was a bit late. And Mark, I'm sorry I missed, I think, probably most of what your comment was. It ties into what I was going to share. I've been doing the Pachamama Alliance Game Changer course along with the rest of the board of the Green Coalition, which I'm on. And, you know, a couple people who are architecture firm consultants were talking about the carbon emissions from building, like actually building and development, and how very little attention has been paid to that. And because I've been, and you know, there's so many different approaches to look at. I've been looking at, hey, let's, you know, my goal was to plant 1,000 trees a year, you know, minimum in Ojai. But then reading again what Paul Hawken's been saying in Drawdown, that really the biggest contributor is refrigerants and you know, refrigerators and I'm going to say it wrong, chlorocarbon, whatever they emit. Yeah, I can't recall what it's called.
Fluorocarbons.
Yeah, and so we're focusing on, you know, CO2 emissions in cars and all that, but really the refrigerants that we're using in all our buildings and industry are like the number one concern, that if somehow we can come up with new technology, or I don't think we're going to use less. Unfortunately, I think we're tied into technology to be the Band-Aid. And as I've said on the last meeting, I think it's more about looking at our culture, taking a deep dive into our culture and lifestyles and being willing to shift some of that rather than keep on going in the direction we're going with new tech or even our trim tab shifts still going in the same direction. So I'm always encouraging all of us to stay in the inquiry of what's possible beyond getting things back to normal or usual, which will never happen.
Yeah, Ray, one of the things that we were talking about in one of our prior meetings is the distinction between pollution and emissions into the atmosphere that affect climate as distinct from necessarily broader environmental concerns. Steve, would you like to just clarify that, or Phil, would you like to clarify that distinction for people that are on the call?
Well, I would have to say that Ray makes a good point that refrigerants are an important portion of greenhouse gas emissions. But I would say that, you know, being a mechanical engineer and seeing what's coming in the area of refrigerants is that there's a very big push, just as Mark explained, for low carbon concrete as an example. There's also a really big push for low GHG refrigerants. So there's every expectation that that's happening, that's going to happen. And we still will need to continue to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and methane and the other greenhouse gases. Ray makes a good point, but I think there's help coming.
Good, thank you. Somebody else want to ask a question or make a comment or have a conversation around this?
For the next question, I'd just like to make a reminder to please mute yourselves. Mr. Miley, we can hear your microphone, so would you please mute yourself while you're not speaking? And then if anyone else has their open mic besides those who are, Jim, you're obviously fine, open, and Mark, keep yours on.
Jack Weber, you should mute your phone as well.
Right, and Mr. Miley, can you mute your phone, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we can proceed.
Okay, floor is open. Mark, would you like to say anything more specific in terms of Ojai, in terms of recommendations that you would make to either enhance the existing REACH code or to introduce new possibilities or different strategies that you would recommend to the council?
There are a lot of different ideas that, you know, could happen. I think it's starting to happen on the state level. So, but we can get ahead of the curve. Like Marin County is introducing their own, you know, low carbon concrete ordinance, you know, separate, you know, ahead of everybody. And so that's why in my closing remarks, I think this committee can be a leader and go, you know, beyond. And you know, whether, you know, one of the ideas is this requiring, you know, I think giving incentives to developers or builders for maybe doing the voluntary green measures that are listed in the Cal Green, but also you could say, you know, we'll give you, you know, extra density if you exceed Title 24 by 25% or something like, those are some of the ideas.
Have you any particular statistics or rules of thumb regarding increased costs for going that way, or going in those directions in various projects as opposed to conventional thinking?
There is increased cost, of course, and that's a lot of my resistance in my projects is just my clients just don't want to go beyond what is mandatory. The mandatory features are getting stricter and stricter, and like I said, I think it's going to be code to be zero carbon in the near future, and that's it's going to be costly. Or the carbon offsets, I think is you're going to have to pay for those. I'm not sure how much those are going to be, but I would say, right now, if to go to 25% above Title 24 would maybe cost you 5% of the project. And so that's my guess.
Good. Yes, Ray, real quick.
Yeah, I might have missed it, but Mark, could you define what low carbon concrete is?
Yeah, you did miss it.
I'll look it up.
Let's do that offline. Don't go back into it.
I'll Google it.
All right, Bill, Congressman, sorry, Councilman.
No, never going to do that. Mark, I wanted to highlight what you said, which I think was very significant and maybe glossed over a little bit. And that's using things like density bonus to incentivize, because if you're talking, like, for example, we know that what I think the estimates are, just the land cost for housing in California can be 30–40% of the total cost of housing by some estimates. And the point being is that the density bonus, particularly for things like housing, really mitigates against the impact, particularly on low to moderate income. So that's an excellent suggestion that I hope takes hold. Where a 5% cost, a 5% cost penalty with an adequate density bonus completely obliterates that cost increase in terms of the incentives. So I just want to make sure everybody understands how important what Mark kind of said in passing is regarding things like a density bonus, counter incentives. It's really important.
Maybe fast tracking projects would be another incentive.
And that too, because the regulation in land, by some estimates, are say 40% of the cost of projects these days in California. So we talked about templates at the last council meeting for ADUs to try to help with fast tracking. So yeah, more liberal use of density bonuses, fee waivers, and fast tracking and templates could really help offset the cost of these pursuing these goals. That's really important.
Thank you, Councilman. Any other questions or commentary from anybody else on the call? Michelle and then Ray again.
Okay, quick question. I don't know, Mark, if you're familiar, in addition to the recently passed REACH code, are there other policies in Ojai's building code that kind of go above and beyond the requirements? So, I don't know if you have the answer, or if Bill or Souza, since you've been on council, if you're familiar with anything else that Ojai has done already to enhance our building code to be more green.
Well, the dark sky ordinance, that's a kind of one of the points in the lead system, and so that's already part of our code now.
Good. Bill?
Yeah, we tried to do some alternative building methods and kind of got frustrated. You mentioned cob building and other types of alternatives that combine lower cost and low carbon impacts and energy efficiency. And I think that's definitely something we need to move on. And for various reasons, we've been frustrated in doing that, including problems with the way the fire marshal administers building code reviews and things like that. So, Mark, ideas you have along those lines, please share them.
I'll put those together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Souza? You're okay?
I don't have anything to add right now. Thank you.
Okay, Ray?
I just read about what low carbon concrete is. So I was concerned about mining, because everything we talk about, I don't think at this point it's wise or empathetic to leave out the climate justice or social justice aspect, how, you know, lower income people tend to get the brunt of all our industrialization, whether it's a green product or not. So I was reading that they're using waste product and, you know, in the low carbon concrete. But I really want to just presence that thought, because we don't, especially in our valley, we don't necessarily have huge industrial impacts here, but there's people that are impacted.
Great.
In either case. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else about building or the field area of building topic? Okay, well, thank you very much, Mark, for that primer. And now we've got some more learning to do and more conversations to have around what we recommend in that regard. I think it should be clear to everybody, we have no authority or intention really to take any action beyond making our best effort at giving recommendations to council. So we're not independent of that. That's our primary vehicle for trying to impact the future. Steve, would you like to take the ball and talk a little bit about the greenhouse gas inventory?
Sure. So what I'm going to do is update us on the state of the greenhouse gas inventory. About 1 month ago, the council met and we presented as a committee our 6-month work plan, proposing both to conduct a greenhouse gas inventory and also to work on the general plan update, a climate element for that. The direction from council was that we focus first on the greenhouse gas inventory. So I'm going to bring you up to date on where we stand with that development now. So there are principally 2 members of our committee who are working on this technical work product. Phil White, who introduced himself as a mechanical engineer. He worked initially in the field of aerospace, but also importantly, he served soon after Ventura County cleaved itself off of the South Coast Air Quality Management District as the chief air pollution officer, the air pollution control officer for the county of Ventura. He also served on the Ventura County Planning Commission during the time that Ventura County was developing its general plan. So he comes in as an absolute A-lister for background in developing a greenhouse gas inventory. For myself, I have a doctorate in air pollution control. I've advised Congress, National Academy of Science, EPA, various local and non-local agencies, and was a member of the Technical Advisory Committee to the South Coast Air Quality Management District during the 1980s and 1990s, a period over which we were finally able to see the Santa Monica Mountains. So both of us have deep experience in the areas of air quality. But in addition, and importantly on this team, we have Dr. Lackey Tizopoulos, who is the current air pollution control officer for Ventura County, and his head engineer, Ali Kazemi, as well as the California Air Resources Board. So this is really fundamentally a technical issue of engineering, science, and an accounting process that has its own nomenclature. So I think it's important because there have been some, I think, misunderstandings represented as we're developing this in terms of what our focus will be on and why. So for the greenhouse gas emission model for the city of Ojai, there really are 3 key, or actually 2 key pollutants. One is carbon dioxide, which is coming from the burning of fossil fuel, and methane, which is natural gas. The HFC, hydrofluorocarbon, which is the refrigerant replacement for the ozone damaging CFCs, is also an issue. But in terms of the priority, CO2 emissions and methane emissions are really where the area is, the greenhouse gas inventory is going to be focused. Now, in terms of sources, again, the definitions and the nomenclature are important. So the first source are stationary sources. And at the council meeting on the 9th of February, I think there was a misunderstanding of what a stationary source is. The buildings that Mark Whitman talked about are not considered in air pollution parlance to be a stationary source, even though they don't move. They are represented as area sources. So we are blessed in Ojai not to have a lot of industry, and it's largely industry. It's sources that receive permits from the Air Pollution Control District that are considered stationary sources. So for Ojai, there really are only 5 sources that are large enough even to release annual emissions data. So we're basing the initial inventory on the basis of 2019 emissions from those particular permitted sources, and they're not major. They're not major in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are attributable to those sources. Then there are area sources, and Mark very clearly indicated that if we include both the emissions from the building materials that go into that and are embedded, as well as the utilization of those structures. So this includes for Ojai residential, commercial, and institutional buildings. And there, in terms of use, the primary greenhouse gas emission is carbon dioxide that comes from the burning of natural gas or methane. So those are called area sources. Then there are on-road and off-road mobile sources, so cars and other small engines that are burners. Then the next set would be indirect sources. So that would be the fossil fuel combustion in electric generating plants that are attributed to Ojai, and methane, which also comes from the biologic destruction of municipal waste. We have, with Ali Gazemi and currently under review at the California Air Resources Board, completed the initial inventory for the stationary sources in Ojai and for the on-road mobile sources. Now, one thing that's important, again, in terms of the accounting process here, is that mobile sources for Ojai are assigned to the vehicle fleet of the residents of Ojai for all of our travel. So as we go in and out of Ojai, there are normative values to assign for vehicle miles traveled, emissions from the fleet, and we're utilizing that the CARB-related standards for that. So that's essentially where we stand today. I would like to point out that, and Bill, you might comment on this, but at the February 9th meeting, Councilmember Wyrick suggested that the inventory be expanded to an airshed analysis. What an airshed analysis is, and the reason that you would do that, is if you're looking at conventional criteria air pollutants, ones that have specific human health impacts. So we would be very interested in knowing what the total sources are in the Ojai Valley for projecting ozone pollution, for example. And we would need an airshed analysis for that. What we're doing with the greenhouse gas inventory is we're not looking at criteria air pollutants. We're looking at air pollutants that have a global impact and doing our share of reducing those emissions. And so the focus is specifically on emissions that come out of the city of Ojai, because we're making recommendations to the Ojai City Council on ways in which we can do our share to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not doing an airshed analysis, and that would in fact be inappropriate.
Steve, you mentioned at some earlier meeting, as I recall, that Ventura County is the fastest growing, hottest county in America. Is that correct? I can't remember.
Well, I think it's in California, and I mean, it just happens to be empirically that it's observed that we're warming fairly quickly. It's hard to know at this point whether that's a short-term aberration or that we really stand out.
But most of that comes from sources outside of Ojai, elsewhere in the county?
Well, so greenhouse gases, the whole focus of greenhouse gases, whether it's CO2 or HFCs or methane, are on a global scale. So it's the trapping of heat within the atmosphere. It's not a localized effect. So the CO2 that we emit in the Ojai Valley isn't substantively changing the impact of climate change on the Ojai Valley.
Got it. Michelle?
I was just going to comment that it was in a Washington Post article that did name Ventura County as the fastest warming in the contiguous United States. So yes, we are, fastest warming region. That was a Washington Post article, I think, in 2019.
Thanks. Bill?
Yeah, I think Steve missed part of my point, and that is that according to how LAFCO guidelines are set up, we have two tranches, actually three tranches of influence over land use over land use regulations, which is directly related to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we have the most control inside of our jurisdiction. We have a fair amount of control, a fair amount of influence in the sphere of influence just outside the jurisdiction of the city, which is areas that are basically pre-approved for annexation if we ever decide to pull that trigger, and the county is supposed to follow our lead on land use policies in that area. And then we're also supposed to be consulted with the area of interest, which is the Ojai Valley. So to the extent that land use policies are impactful on greenhouse emissions, it is relevant what happens outside the city's jurisdiction in terms of the influence that the city can leverage.
Interesting. Phil?
Yeah, well, just to comment on this conversation between Bill and Steve. Yes, Steve's absolutely correct that when you do airshed, you're talking about conventional air pollution, you're talking about ozone air pollution. So it's misplaced when you're talking about dealing with climate change. Now, I will commend Bill for saying that Ojai is influential in the Ojai Valley by setting examples for what happens in the county, what policies the county board of supervisors.
Well, and also they're supposed to have land use policies consistent with our policies in the sphere of influence.
Basically, Ojai, are you done?
Yeah.
Ojai certainly is the little city with the big megaphone, and is doing a great job for setting the example for other jurisdictions, including the county. And the adoption of the REACH code is a prime example in the 2040 county general plan for unincorporated parts. There is the promise to adopt a REACH code, and the example that City of Ojai has set will help the County of Ventura figure out the details of what they do in the county level. And I think that I'm on the County Climate Council and Climate Emergency Council, they call it, that we will be making recommendations to the board to do just that. I think we Ojai are very fortunate to have the air pollution control district in our corner working on this greenhouse gas emission inventory. Lockie and Ali are enthusiastic about doing this, and I think there's real interest in expanding the effort from from doing Ojai's inventory to doing the whole county, to doing all the jurisdictions in the county. So again, Little Ojai is setting the pace for the whole area here.
I think both of you are still missing the point somewhat that we have leverage on land use policies outside of the city jurisdiction that are impactful in terms of greenhouse emissions, and we should not neglect that.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
that,
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And I encourage you and the other council members to do just that.
But
which is, pardon me?
Yeah, quickly. But we are focusing the greenhouse gas emission inventory on the city and the city boundary, not the extensive boundary. That is the boundary that is being tied, and the influence of the county is already being set in motion with the committee that Phil is on and the general plan that's been established by the county. Our focus will be the greenhouse gas emissions within the city boundary.
I still think that probably both of you need to get a little more familiar with the LAFCO structure because it is something that is legal and agreed to by the county supervisors in terms of how land use policies are set.
Okay, we can make a note we'll make a note to look at the LAFCO structure in more detail.
Yeah, it's really a separate subject. Steve's absolutely right on greenhouse gas emission inventory is a calculation of Ojai, the city of Ojai's contribution to worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And that's the focus of what we in the APCD are doing.
Okay, good. Anybody else have any comments or questions around the greenhouse inventory? And Bill, your point is noted. Anyone? Okay, then let's segue to the last point of our agenda, which is some specific recommendations that we as a committee are submitting to the council. Phil, do you want to jump in on that one, or Michelle?
Sure, I will. And I don't know if we're going to do a share screen where we can see the text. When the climate committee presented its report last summer to the city council, included were recommendations that the city council take action to reduce the city's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions for both buildings and for mobile sources. We followed up in a couple of our committee meetings last fall, a little bit before the REACH code was developed. And specifically, yeah, it's up on there. I hope everybody can see that. This is a proposal from the climate committee recommending that the city council direct staff regarding conversion of city buildings and vehicles to electric. And let me just read it. In light of the city's ongoing efforts to address climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, provide policy direction to staff, city staff, supporting planning for conversion of city buildings and vehicles to electricity, including the following points. A, give support to the goal, it's a goal of making city buildings and vehicle fleet carbon neutral by 2025. B, give support for conversion of energy systems and city buildings from natural gas to electricity, particularly at the time of scheduled equipment replacement, and discourage the purchase of new natural gas fueled equipment. C, give support for additional vehicle fleet conversion to electric vehicles, EVs, particularly at the time of scheduled vehicle replacement. encourage the replacement of light trucks and other vehicles with EVs when practical and available. And finally, discourage the addition of new gasoline-powered vehicles. D, give support for the installation of additional EV charging stations for both city and public vehicles. And finally, give support to the seeking of grants for these purposes. This proposal was taken from language that I and Dick Baldwin, another former APCD director, whom I have worked with on promoting climate change solutions, and was presented to the County Board of Supervisors just prior to their adopting the policies for the county purchasing department to buy electric vehicles when they do vehicle replacements. So our proposal is to recommend, our committee is in alignment on this, to recommend this to the council at their next meeting.
Susan?
Would you be willing to add electric bikes to your proposal? Because the problem with electric vehicles is that it's still a car that needs a parking space. And it's ridiculous for city staff to drive to town for lunch, and the parking is at a premium during that time. And if we're going to have a parking moratorium, which is what I'm in favor for, unless we remove parking on Ojai Avenue, I feel that we need that, as much as possible, the city should set an example.
I don't disagree, Souza. I think those are fine ideas that go a little bit beyond the precise things we're suggesting here, and would encourage you to deliberate the subject at the council and hear from the public on this.
In terms of our recommendation, though, Phil, could we not just simply say replacement of new vehicles and additional acquisitions such as bicycles?
That's so common. It's common sense.
I guess we could do that, yeah.
It doesn't hurt anything. It's consistent with what we're trying to say.
Uh-huh.
That might just be the nudge that you need.
Okay, Bill?
Where I think it's directly relevant is the design of the charging stations. There's a different design of charging stations for personal electric vehicles as opposed to larger ones, and the incremental cost of including that as a goal. The charging stations are both for bicycles and the sort of revolution that's coming in quad EV personal vehicles. I think it might be worthwhile just to note that the charging stations ought to be multi-purpose for all kinds of personal electric transportation, not just automobiles. So that would be an easy thing to add, I think, to what Susan's talking about. The other thing I want to mention is that you might want to, in terms of, it's an interesting issue. The city buildings aren't just City Hall. Includes the police station, that's actually city owned, and the Help of Ojai facilities. And it's interesting how I hopefully we're talking about city facilities writ large and not just City Hall. I just thought I'd mention that. And the other thing in terms of being impactful for the entire in the public sector for the entire valley is school district. I think a similar proposal to the school district, particularly with the bond issue money that they have going, and how the direction ought to be hopefully guided in how they direct that bond issue money in terms of renovation and adaptations of buildings. I'd be very timely to have a similar proposal in front of the school board.
Good. Great. Right.
Thank you. First, I want to say I understand the scope of this committee being greenhouse gas emissions. But as you probably gathered by now, I'm more of a generalist or connect the dots. So if we're going to look at EVs for the city, replacement, or even before they're replaced, I would really like city leadership to take on looking at what truly is the greenest EV to use. A lot of you have already heard me speak a lot about, I'm not in favor of lithium batteries, and there's a lot of new tech coming down the road, and there's a lot of collateral costs using lithium in the mining, strip mining, and the lives, the laborers, and everything that goes into creating an EV that the end user doesn't necessarily think about. I know hydrogen cells are coming down the line. There's all sorts of new battery tech. So I'm not for, hey, a truck goes out next week, let's replace it with a current EV. I don't plan on buying one unless my car breaks down, until there's new technology that I know doesn't have the current impact that the current tech has globally, that we forget to think about sometimes.
Yeah, Ray, I don't know. Let me ponder that, but at least I can't speak for the other committee members, but personally, that's going into a level of detail and recommendation that I would clearly see outside our scope, and maybe even inappropriate. I don't disagree necessarily that that's a piece of work that somebody should do, but I don't think that's the work of this committee. I think that's the acquisition process, and whoever goes into whatever does that. And I also think that it starts looking like promoting a particular brand policy, as distinct from letting the competitive bidding processes sort out all those things. And if it needs to be a part of the RFP criteria in a purchasing, acquisition, I think that's fine. But I think it's beyond the scope of this committee. And personally, I would not be aligned with going into that level of detail, but other members may see it differently. Phil?
Well, I think Ray makes a good point that the existing batteries for electric vehicles may not be the same batteries that are in the vehicle fleet in 20 years. However, lithium-ion batteries are pretty much the standard now, and while others are working on alternatives, and the best ones will come forward. That's what we have to work with. And what the imperative here is to reduce consumption of gasoline and replace it with electricity generated by wind and solar green methods of generating electricity. That's the imperative. And that doesn't prevent batteries from getting better.
Anybody else have a comment or want to share anything about the recommendation before we go to the second recommendation that we're making? Mayor? Betsy? You have to get, you're on mute.
This may be beyond the wrong time and beyond the scope of this committee. As I'm listening though to this and saying, yes, 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 of course, of course, of course. I'm also saying, where's the money? The money, no money, no money, no money, no money. So does anybody here in the little box have any connection to some money? Some heavy money to make all this happen, which would be fabulous really quickly, because as we know, we are living in a real-time world and we got to get a move on here. So I'm just actually as sort of a shout out, like, help if anybody has that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's all.
I would like to respond to that. And of course, money is an important part of this. And I think that we phrased the wording in this proposal to understand that the city has a budget crisis or problem, and recognize that, and that we don't have an expectation that all of the city's vehicles and buildings are going to go all electric immediately. However, certain equipment needs replacement from time to time. I know I'm associated with a museum, and I understand the air conditioner quit on the museum building, which is owned by the city. That would be a perfect candidate for when it gets replaced with a heat pump air conditioning system instead of a gas-fired one. Same with vehicles. The county policy the Board of Supervisors adopted emphasized when vehicles are being replaced, that the priority is to replace them with electric vehicles. Again, they did not mandate that we're going to immediately convert all the vehicles to electric. The last point we made in the proposal is to encourage the seeking of grants to pay for these conversions. I do believe, I think we as a committee believe that there is going to be money coming from the state and the federal government and maybe utilities for that matter to make these conversions. And, you know, we all need to be on the lookout for that money.
It's also pretty important to remember that I think it was in the December or the January council meeting when Randy proposed narrowing the scope of our committee for the next 6 months. Originally, in our plan, we had envisioned that we would not necessarily do all the fundraising, but at least we'd have the scan to be looking for the kinds of things Phil just spoke about, as well as perhaps suggesting more proactive strategies for beginning to find, you know, go to Uber and make a proposal, you know, or go to Elon, you know, I mean, there's lots of places you could raise a request to at least open up possibilities. But if no one's doing anything about that, then it's like, you know, if it comes and hits you, you're lucky. But you have to be holding, I believe, the intention to be supportable and supported by other people that have a stake in your success. And that's the whole point, is to, one, identify them, two, be in relationship with them, three, make requests, and four, play the percentages in terms of what's available. Michelle, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just along the lines of kind of how are we going to afford to do this? One thing that's come to my mind is kind of the budget. The city's budget is a reflection of our priorities, right? The community's priorities. So we have a budget setting process every year, which will be coming up actually over the next few months, because the new budget will go into effect in July. And so what I'd like to see is like, okay, we have a $10 million budget for the city, and I know money is tight. That's not to suggest that we don't have to, you know, make sure we keep our costs at a minimum, but I would suggest we go line by line and say, can this specific project wait one more year? You know, what are our priorities? What are we funding today? What are we postponing till tomorrow? Can we afford to delay reducing emissions another year and another year and another year? So that's just my, where I'm coming from personally. I'd like to see us look at the budget and look at, you know, our priorities as a community, and is our budget reflective of our priorities? Because funds will get spent one way or the other. Some things have to be done. They're in disrepair. There are dangers associated with not fixing maybe a pergola, for example. Or could that wait another year? Could we defer that cost and instead reduce our emissions in various ways? So that's one comment I wanted to make.
One thing I would also add, and this really comes from my corporate work, I mean, budgets and resources is almost a universal issue, no matter what. But I try to point out that if you commit to what you want and need as a project, for example, and you don't have the money to pay for it, that's a breakdown, and you have to figure out where are we going to get the money. Not we need to get the money before we commit. In other words, either money becomes an excuse for not doing something, or it becomes a breakdown that we have to work on in order to do something. So it's a mindset issue, in my view, in terms of how we relate to the fact that we're never going to have all the resources we want. But we still need to let our commitments drive the future, as distinct from necessarily let the budget determine the future. Phil?
Yeah, good points, Jim, and everybody. One thing that's a common refrain in our climate committee meetings is shovel-ready projects. And that means that a jurisdiction has done what Jim suggested, made policy decisions and said, this is where we're headed, in knowing that they need the money to implement them, but ready to go, ready to accept money and build charging stations and convert buildings and vehicle fleets. So Ojai can be shovel ready and be first in line to get whatever money might be coming down the pike.
And
Ray,
then-
real quick. Or sorry, Bessie.
Well, and visualizing what that is after receiving all the money and then working backwards. Thank you. Because we're broke right now. I just want to say that. Okay.
I just wanted to say one of the beautiful things now with so much new technology coming down the pike is that companies, like Jim say, we get into branding, want to do beta tests. And there is potential for the city to partner with a company that has a product the city might want to use as a beta test and an extreme discount, if not given as a model.
Great, thank you. Brian, did you want to say anything? Okay, good. Anybody else? All right, Steve, you want to mention the other recommendation?
Sure. And so the other recommendation, and by the way, these two recommendations have been passed through our committee, and we're all in alignment that it should be brought forward to the council. This happened at the last week in February. I happened to be at our post office, and I don't know why the topic came up, but the clerk who I was purchasing stamps from was elated that they're going to be getting an entirely new fleet of vehicles. In fact, she said that the vehicle fleet that they have now is being held together. It's 25 to 30 years old with bubble gum and duct tape. And so within the next 2 years, the Postal Service is due to completely replace this entire fleet. So I decided, well, I better come back again and ask for the postal supervisor. So I spoke with Angeline Walker, who's in charge of the local post office. And she said that they have no direct authority over what particular vehicles are installed there. And it turns out that that same week, there was an announcement that the Postal Service had led a contract with a company called Oshkosh Defense and that they are building a fleet of brand new vehicles. They're going to be air conditioned. They're going to have cameras on all sides. And they're also going to be configured for the new package delivery options that the post office is engaged in. Well, a fraction of these vehicles are going to be battery electric vehicles. And so it seems that we have the opportunity now. The only way that we really as a city have for influencing this is through our congressional delegation. So we're asking for the council to have staff send a request to our congressional delegation to request that the vehicles that are replaced it's going to be an entire fleet replacement. It will be all of those vehicles now, which are not only burning fossil fuel, but they are also doing so in a very inefficient way. So as an airshed, conventional air pollution problem, they are a big piece of that puzzle. So we'll be asking for a council to take that action.
Terrific. Anybody have any other questions or comments about any of that? All right, Michelle, you want to talk about the next meeting?
Yep. So we have our next meeting 1 month from now. I believe it's April 14th at 4 p.m. So the city will send out that announcement as they have for this and prior meetings, and it'll be on the city's website as well. So I think that's all.
Great. I would like to then, on behalf of the committee, thank all of you for participating and for attending, whether you spoke or not. You're welcome to any of our meetings. And we're looking forward to, again, maintaining this spirit of dialogue with the community, not just information sharing and point of view sharing, but to be able to have a discourse around our future and the possibilities that we are all committed to continue to have Ojai be the greatest place to live on the planet. So anyway, thank you very much. And
thanks, Mark Whitman. Thank you.
And Mark, a special thank you to you. And until the 14th.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, committee.
Bye all.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.